Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the second SELCAN webinar in the series. It's around communicating low carbon credentials. My name's Heather and I'm the Climate Change and Environment Officer for South and East Lincolnshire. I help facilitate the running of the SELCAN network, who are your hosts today, along with my colleague Alex Cockburn from Change Agents. So who are SELCAN? We are a network of volunteer representatives from the private, public and third sector who come together to share best practice and expertise and drive forward action in relation to climate change. If you have any questions as you go along, please pop them in the Q&A chat and we'll answer them at the end. I hope you enjoy the presentation, and without further ado, I'll hand over to Alex.
Okay, welcome to this presentation on communicating low carbon credentials. I'm Alex, as Heather introduced, and I come from a charity called Change Agents UK, and we are a sustainability education charity and non-profit sustainability recruitment specialists established over 25 years ago to create positive social and environmental change, trying to disrupt this cycle of you need experience to get experience through the provision of education and employment opportunities in sustainability. And we do this by trying to raise awareness, support and empower people, and build networks within the sustainability sphere to help people, make that change and be part of a net zero future. In this session, we are going to be looking at low carbon credentials. And we're going to look at why they're important, what low carbon credentials exist, and we're going to talk a bit about how we can talk and communicate about these low carbon credentials to our clients and even amongst our own staff. So to begin with, we're going to look at what are low carbon credentials and why do we need them? And it's nice to start off with looking at what does the phrase low carbon mean. So low carbon is shorthand for a reduction in carbon dioxide emissions, CO2. It can also refer to a reduction of other greenhouse gases too, so including methane, nitrous oxide and CFCs. And then when we get onto low carbon credentials, they can mean various things. And some of the most easily identifiable ones are net zero, carbon neutral and zero emissions. And these are the most widely recognised terms. But why is it important to talk about, the reduction of emissions? So the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015 was the first ever global agreement on climate change. 194 countries pledged they would try to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions to limit global warming to 2 degrees and make every effort to reduce that to 1.5 degrees. It's estimated that warming above 2 degrees will expose nearly 3 billion people to severe climate risk. And if warming can be cut to 1.5 degrees, this figure could be halved. Achieving this goal is crucial and requires a huge reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions, aiming for net zero by 2050 overall. However, based on global pledges made at COP28 and government action and policy, we can make these climate projections. So on the screen, you can see a kind of thermometer from the Climate Action Tracker, and it talks about whereabouts we're at on reaching that goal of net zero by 2050. And the results show quite a range. We are not on track to achieve our targets currently. Even in the most optimistic scenario, we're on track to have warming of 1.8 degrees Celsius, which will cause, millions of people to be affected. And even in the worst case scenario, we're seeing warming of over 2.7 degrees Celsius, which would be cataclysmic for the environment. Looking at that in a slightly different way, this graph, also by the Climate Action Tracker, shows the gap between our current trajectory and where we need to be. Overall, we need to have greater ambition with our low carbon trajectory and more action on the ground to achieving those targets we set, and holding ourselves accountable to make sure we're following through with those goals. And low carbon credentials can help on all accounts of this and help us achieve that journey from ambition to action to accountability, and help us achieve those targets that we want. In the UK, in 2019, the UK government committed to dramatically reducing emissions legally by 78% by 2035 and to achieve net zero by 2050. Since then, in 2021, the government published its net zero strategy, setting out how the UK will deliver on its commitments within the Climate Change Act. And from that, we can see that achieving the UK net zero goal by 2050 will require decarbonisation of all sectors. And you can see that business in the UK totals for about 18% of the total domestic greenhouse gas emissions, at least in 2021, which is the most recent data we have. Within that, looking at small businesses, that 18%, 50% of it small businesses account for 50% of it, and 94% of those have taken physical action to take net zero. So even though smaller businesses often have relatively low emission footprints at an individual level, estimates suggest that collectively they can account for around 43 to 53% of UK business greenhouse gas emissions. And when we add in household and the public sector to that mix, we get a smaller, we get around a third of the UK total emissions. So even though you might think that small business might have quite a relatively small impact, when we bring them all together, we're talking about quite a big portion of our greenhouse gas emissions in the UK. But thankfully, low carbon credentials can help us on that journey to net zero. And what we're going to do now is look at what low carbon credentials exist. So one of the most common low carbon credentials you might come across is net zero, and that's the one that's most commonly used, but you may have also heard of carbon neutral. And understanding the difference between what these actually mean is actually quite important. So firstly, neither of them represent zero emissions, whereby we release no greenhouse gas emissions at all into the atmosphere. And given that greenhouse gas emissions are a leading cause of climate change, zero emissions would be ideal, but there are likely going to be some very difficult to remove emissions remaining in our processes, but all from the most ambitious action. So then we go into the idea of reducing, but not removing at all. And this is where we look at carbon neutral. And carbon neutral means removing the equivalent amount of CO2 to what's emitted through activities across our supply chains by investing in carbon sinks that absorb CO2. So carbon sinks, like oceans and forests, they absorb more carbon from the atmosphere than they emit. And most businesses who are carbon neutral also try to reduce their emissions, but it doesn't actually involve that in the definition of carbon neutral. So if you have a carbon neutral organisation, they're not necessarily reducing their emissions, but they have offset their equivalent. And we'll come on to offsetting a little bit later on. Then net zero is just this, but expanded in scale. So going beyond just the removal of carbon emissions to include all greenhouse gases, such as methane and nitrous oxide. It means cutting greenhouse gas emissions to close to a zero as possible, with any remaining emissions being reabsorbed from the atmosphere. And that's the definition we have from the UN as well. Net zero means cutting greenhouse gas emissions to as close to a zero as possible, with any remaining emissions reabsorbed from the atmosphere. They can still offset in this case, but there is an equal, if not greater, emphasis on following the ambitious emissions reduction trajectory. So we're aiming for that reduction in emissions rather than just offsetting those emissions that still exist. So to recap that a little bit, we've got carbon neutral. So carbon neutrality means not adding any new greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere, and where emissions do continue, they must be offset by absorbing an equivalent amount from the atmosphere, for example, through carbon capture or by carbon credit schemes. Net zero is expanding that in scale and really focusing on that reduction of emissions and still offsetting, but only the really, really essential bits we have to offset. A net zero is often considered that gold standard for corporate climate action. And we can see here in this table the difference between carbon neutral and net zero. So carbon neutral only focuses on carbon dioxide. It only really focuses on scopes 1 and scope 2 emissions. It can be quite specified on products. For example, you might buy coffee that is carbon neutral, but whereas net zero is often organisation wide, so a bit more of a holistic approach. And carbon neutral often includes any amount of offsetting, whereas net zero only focuses on those specific removals that are required. So the good thing is that net zero is becoming a big trend at the moment, and we're seeing net zero commitments covering most of the world's emissions, population, and GDP. So over 900 of the world's top 2,000 companies have net zero commitments, and this can be seen as a positive. However, greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets set by organisations vary hugely in scope, comprehensiveness, and ambition. Many include a commitment to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by a certain date. However, claiming a net zero goal is good, but you can go one better by proving your targets as being science-based targets. And the target is only science-based if they're in line with what the latest climate science deems necessary to meet the 1.5 degrees Paris Agreement goal. Science-based targets focus on deeming what's best in considering the climate science and deeming what's necessary to meet the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. And science-based targets are important because they not only do they show your commitment to net zero, but they also strengthen your reputation, shape your business strategy, increase investor confidence, and help manage those future risks. Is because by basing your goals and targets on science, you are, showing your commitment and show that it gives that additional aspect of compensating for your goal and your targets. In terms of actual low carbon credentials, there are lots out there. And there's a range out there, and in these orange boxes, you can see that some of them are different for each stage of the low carbon journey. And we've matched this to the 4-stage process outlined by the PAS 2060 standard. This firstly involves an assessment of greenhouse gas emissions based on the accurate measurement data of your organisation. And there's lots of separate standards there as well in that first box. The second is reduction of emissions through a target-driven carbon management plan. The third step is offsetting. So offsetting any of those excess emissions, often by purchasing carbon credits or taking part in those carbon sink schemes. And for example, the Woodland Code UK is a well-trusted organisation that does that by planting woodlands. And then finally, it's about documenting and reporting any of the data you do collect through explanatory statements and public disclosure. And there are credentials for all of these. We're not going to go through all of them now, and it's worth determining which one is best for your organisation. Many of them are guidelines, and some of them are third-party accredited. And third-party accreditation is really useful in gaining credibility and making sure you're on track. At the bottom are some routes for making sure you're on track. For example, we have the Carbon Trust route to net zero. The BSI comes with lots of these standards. We've got ISO, which is the international organisation for them. And it's really worth going through some of these in your own time and seeing which one fits your organisation the best. And at the end, I'll share some resources that will help you do that. But without further ado, I want to move on to how can we communicate these low carbon credentials, and also what are some of the benefits of being honest and transparent about our low carbon journey. So first of all, there's lots of benefits to having low carbon credentials. Firstly, they increase your reputation. When people can trust and believe what you're saying about your low carbon targets, your reputation is going to increase because people value honesty. Furthermore, it can increase your staff morale, because as your staff realize they're working for an organization that's trying to make a difference, then the morale is going to rise. And finally, it's going to save you money. Cost savings, 63% of people agreed in this BSI research that by having low carbon credentials, you could actually save money in your business. Communicate effectively not only demonstrates compliance with national and international regulations, but also shows foresight and increased ambition. Well-managed and convincing communication can strongly influence an organisation's image. But above all, it's a powerful driver of change. Raising awareness and sharing innovative climate solutions can lead to real and long-lasting change for your organisation. Also, people want transparency. So corporate experts, when asked, thought that consumers were satisfied or quite satisfied with product transparency on sustainability, and 86% of corporate experts thought that. But when actually the same number of consumers were asked, only 41% actually felt they were getting the right amount of information on sustainability. So this transparency and honesty is actually really, really important. And in a world where we're often met with exaggerated truths and just outright lies about climate change and sustainability, honesty and transparency can go a long way in having an impact when communicating our low carbon credentials. In terms of what we can do as individuals and organisations, there's two impacts. We have our footprint, which is our direct impact and our emissions, so all of those scopes 1, 2 and 3. But then we also have our handprint, which is our indirect impact, so our influence on wider society, economy, through education, skills development, outreach and innovations. What we need to do is shrink our footprint, so shrink our emissions, and grow our handprint to make our full contribution to delivering a net zero society. Having low carbon credentials reduces our footprints, but communicating well about them and getting other people to understand them and to adopt their own even increases your handprint, your potential influence, and could lead to an even much bigger impact. For example, if your communications lead to one other organisation adopting low carbon credentials, then your impact has massively increased. So it's part of our overall impact to consider effective communication of low carbon credentials. And being honest can be very beneficial to any organisation, particularly when actually being honest about the problems too. So this increases trust. If we are not only honest and market ourselves as doing really well in some things, but also showing, where the issues are and being transparent about how we're addressing them, goes a long way. If you look at this graph here, it's clear this is actually what people want to see. They want to see honesty, and they're likely to trust your organisation more if you're transparent and honest with them. And it helps to build that trust and belief that you're walking the walk as well as talking the talk. When talking about communicating these credentials, it's really important to have a little bit of a brief on greenwashing. So greenwashing is defined as a PR tactic used to make a company or product appear environmentally friendly without actually meaningfully reducing its environmental impact. And the report in September 2023 found that 1 in every 4 climate-related ESG risk incident in the past year was tied to greenwashing, an increase from 1 in 5 in the previous years. For European, Asian and North American companies, approximately 54% of these greenwashing risk incidents linked to climate change, greenhouse gas emissions or global pollution. Greenwashing can be done through malicious intent, to try and deceive the client, but also can occur through simple lack of understanding or by simply trying to sell ourselves the best we can be. Either way, it's really important to try and avoid that when communicating our low carbon credentials. So what do we need to do to communicate clearly and avoid greenwashing when communicating our low carbon credentials? In the UK, environmental claims made to consumers are governed by the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations Act, which has recently moved to a new act in 2023 regarding digital markets. And to avoid this greenwashing, we must first make sure that our claims are truthful and accurate. We must be clear and ambiguous. We must not omit or hide any important relevant information. So if we're reporting things, we're making sure we're reporting all of our data, not just cherry picking the essentials. Comparisons must be fair and meaningful. And claims must consider the full life cycle of our product or service, not just the resulting emissions. And claims must be substantiated in data. And that goes back to what we were saying before about the science-based targets. It does go a long way if we have evidence for what we're actually saying. And what's more, it's actually illegal to greenwash. If you are found that to be greenwashing, it makes it unlawful for a business to engage in unfair commercial practices. So it's beneficial to make sure we do this anyway. Just to take you through a few types of greenwashing, the first one here is green lighting, which means spotlighting a particular green feature to draw attention away from damaging activities elsewhere. And we have a lot of fossil fuel companies that are culprits of this. For example, BP, spotlighting a lot about their solar farm, when in reality they are one of the greatest emitters in the world at the moment. So 96% of BP's annual spending goes on fossil fuel. So spotlighting their solar farm seems disingenuous. It's also particularly common in the car industry, where manufacturers tout the merits of their electric vehicles, which are often a very small part of their production. For example, zero emissions vehicles made up just 0.2% of Toyota sales in 2021, which is the lowest proportion out of the top 10 car manufacturers worldwide, yet they still shared adverts such as this aiming for zero emissions. Another form is green crowding, and this means comparing yourself to such a small pool so it looks like you're doing quite well. So, for example, we've seen, I'm sure we all know that flying is quite a polluting activity, yet airlines are increasingly comparing their sustainability credentials. This one campaign on the screen by Ryanair said that they're the lowest emissions airline. And this is green crowding because their activities are way more polluting compared to most companies. But if you look in the aviation sector and other airlines, they look quite positive. So it's about, making yourself look better when what you're doing is not necessarily correct. Another form is green hushing. So this means deliberately hiding or underreporting or hiding your ESG credentials from the public to evade any type of scrutiny. BlackRock and HSBC have been accused of this in the past, including HSBC downgrading some of its funds, which were apparently exclusively invested in sustainable assets, to a different type of fund without informing the public. And this was different types of funds that contributed to environmental social factors, but did not actually have to have a sustainable outcome. HSBC claimed this was comply with stricter regulations and standards, but it built that mistrust in the public and avoided that public scrutiny. I did mention before that we are going to come on to looking at a bit about carbon credits and carbon offsetting, because offsetting is quite an important part of carbon neutral and net zero. And these are two strategies used by businesses and individuals to reduce their carbon footprint and mitigate the impact of greenhouse gas emissions on the environment. Carbon credits are the type of permit that can represent the right to emit a certain amount of greenhouse gases. They are typically created through a cap and trade system, where a government sets a limit on the total amount of emissions that are allowed in a given period. Companies that emit less than their allowance can sell their unused credits to other companies that exceed their allowance. Carbon offsets, however, represent a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that has been achieved outside of that cap and trade system. And these reductions are achieved through projects that reduce or remove greenhouse gas emissions, such as reforestation or renewable energy projects. Companies or individuals can purchase carbon offsets to compensate for their own emissions, effectively balancing out their carbon footprint. But it's important to note that sometimes offsetting is viewed as a form of greenwashing, because if an organisation claims that they have reached net zero or carbon neutral, and then when we look a little bit deeper and see that that has been achieved through carbon offsetting, that means that they haven't actually reduced their emissions that much. They've just offset them instead. And from some of the news stories on the board, we can see that this actually has a negative effect on the environment and doesn't actually contribute to that net zero future that we desire. For example, more than 9% of rainforest carbon offsets by the biggest certifier were worthless, and that was in 2023 last year. So how do we actually move forward with communicating and avoiding this greenwashing and making sure our low carbon credentials are effectively communicated? As simply put in a process, when we're considering any organisational communication, it's important to reflect on these following questions. Firstly, why? Why do they exist? Why does your organisation exist? Beyond the net zero plan, is what you do and your purpose for doing it in line with a sustainable future? Are you adapting your business model to prioritise our earth, our home, or are you perpetuating a message of consumerism and resource intensity? If it's the latter, the low carbon credentials risk being a plaster on a gun wound and not being believed by your audience, and also be in danger of greenwashing. The second question you need to consider is, what do they deliver and what do they practice? Are your practices sustainable, and is your product or service actually sustainable? Only then, within these two broader contexts, can we consider the how. So how do you weave these low carbon and sustainable practices into your core business practices to reduce your risk? Overall, this reflects the model of starting with why. Low carbon credentials are great, but to have that bigger impact, we need to communicate how this is not just a tick box, but that we can see where our organisation is going to be at the end of the green transition and be in line with the change business as usual we need to see to get there. So, communicating low carbon credentials. Firstly, make public your commitment and goals and your emissions reduction trajectory. So be honest with the public and make sure that it's very clear to people, how you are achieving and aiming to achieve those low carbon credentials. Secondly, report annually on your progress. Make sure you're regularly reviewing your progress towards those goals and what you can do to make yourself achieve them sooner, or you just make sure you achieve them on time. Thirdly, share your challenges and risks, not just the good bits. So it's great to celebrate the achievements you have in making your progress towards those goals. So make sure you're facing up to the challenges and risks that you have, and communicate those clearly and honestly to people. Clarifying your offsetting approach. So as mentioned, offsetting is susceptible to being a type of greenwashing, and it's important to be really clear about how much offsetting you're doing and through what channels you're offsetting. Next, avoid information overload, but be transparent. So people don't need every bit of data that we collect, but it's really important to give people the information they need to be able to make a suitable judgment about your organisation and how it is approaching the low carbon future. Finally, link to what your customer care about. Get them on board with what's important, and make sure they understand and are part of the future that you're aiming to achieve with those goals. Furthermore, we might see a lot of these types of phrases and words when we talk about and try and communicate things about climate change. So you might see people use the phrase climate change, sustainable, warming, emissions, carbon tax, sacrifice, big oil companies, or decarbonise. And a good way of kind of approaching communicating our low carbon credentials is trying to avoid some of these words and instead focusing on these ideas of more extreme weather, safe and healthy, overheating, carbon pollution. And you see what we're doing here is trying to swap some of these ideas around. So rather than referring to big oil companies, we could think of it as dirty fossil fuel energy. Rather than thinking of something being greener, we can think of it being cleaner, quieter and faster. Rather than talking about climate change, which is sometimes a bit of a complex term, talk about extreme weather and something that's really obvious to people about how we communicate it. And most importantly, it's important to have this sense of purpose and what future are you helping to create. Being future facing and showing what you want to achieve, it can't be easy with things like it can be easy with things like sustainability to feel like it's another do equivalent to admin and ticking a box and making sure you're meeting certain frameworks and goals. But it's not. It's fundamentally the way our society can exist and ideally to flourish. Equally, we may be driven by fear or by powerlessness, and these are quite draining emotions. And instead, we can be driven by active hope. And that's the vision that we're moving towards, which may look different to all of us, and plus some activation within ourselves to be part of achieving this incredible vision. And at Change Agents, we often quite like to share this image at the end because it's about imagining that future that we want to create and considering how can we bring all of our actions, including our organisation and individual actions, into creating this sustainable and net zero future. So I know that was quite a whistle-stop talk, but I'm going to leave you here with a few different resources about net zero. And I'm just going to run you through those quickly so you know which ones we're looking at. So Net Zero, What Businesses Need to Know on the Carbon Trust is a really useful resource that helps determine how you can reach net zero and can help you understand what processes you need to go to get certain accreditation as well, because the Carbon Trust does do accreditation as well. The Little Book of Net Zero for SMEs is specifically for small businesses, so some people in this call may find this useful in terms of how you can help your small business move towards net zero. The next one we have is Net Zero Guidelines, which is a common understanding of net zero, and the next one is our Science-Based Targets Initiative. And remember how important it is to have those science-based targets to be transparent and honest about how you're going to achieve your goals. And it's also quite good to look at those net zero government emissions and look at what the UK government is doing and their roadmap to net zero emissions to help influence and motivate your own journey. And finally, to zoom in a little bit more on those specific credentials in terms of the ISO and the PAS, there's a resource at the bottom that talks about which credentials actually support net zero and your journey on that low carbon future. I hope this presentation was useful for you, and if you do have any questions, please reach out to Change Agents or through Heather, who's running this call as well. But if that's everything, I will happily hand back over to Heather and hopefully we can run through some questions. And I know there's some other talks that want to be going on towards the end of this call. Tony.
Hello. Alex, thank you very much. Yeah, very interesting presentation. My name's Tony Newell. I'm Specialist Environment and Energy Advisor for the South East Lincolnshire Council Partnership. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to say a few words, Heather, much appreciated. It's really just to bring to businesses' attention the offer that's available and support available through the partnership to help businesses on their route to net zero. In terms of my background, I'm an engineer by trade. I've undertaken various roles in my career through building services design, through managing environmental services, developing environmental policies, helping businesses, and more latterly in my career, actually regulating businesses in terms of their impact on the environment. So I feel I can help businesses in this regard from a number of fronts, really. But in terms of the offer that's available, the offer of support, that is really support that can be tailored around the needs of the business. So initially there'll be a diagnostic discussion with the business growth advisor. So it's important that to kind of access this support, you go through a growth up advisor, and the contact details are on the slide there at the bottom. And if it's felt that you'd benefit from my particular support around environmental or energy and low carbon issues, then you'd be referred to me, and it's fully funded, so it's free to businesses, and it can include typically an on-site survey. So I'll visit the business, have a look round, look at environmental impact, the processes that are taking place, looking at the energy processes that consume energy, for example, and cause some of the emissions. And I will work with the business, produce an action plan, a smart action plan in terms of some of the steps that can be taken to help reduce emissions, some of the measures, cost those out, look at the payback periods, what the impact will be. So kind of business cases for each of the steps that can be taken, really. And there are a couple of main reasons. I think you touched on them, Alex, in terms of why businesses are getting in touch with me and through the partnership. One is cost. It's important to them because of the recent energy crisis, but also they want to improve their green credentials, as you've more than touched on in your presentation. And quite often it's both, and they do go hand in hand quite regularly, those cost reductions and reductions in environmental impact. So businesses are coming through and asking for this kind of help, and I will help businesses to develop a environmental policy statement as well, that they can market and help promote their green credentials. But it can be shaped around the business. So if as a business owner you've got some issues that you want to explore, you've got a particular project in mind, we can shape the support around that. So contact details on the screen. I'd actively encourage you to go through Grants for Growth programme and get that support. And as I say, it is free. So yeah, thank you very much. And back to you, Heather.
Lovely. Thank you, Tony. It's really helpful to be aware of the service you're providing, which I'm sure will be of great benefit to people. So thank you for sharing that with us. And also thank you to Alex. It was a fantastic presentation. Lots of really interesting stats in there as well, and really helpful to look at the sort of framing of language. That seems like a really key thing and a potential pitfall for people to avoid potentially. I don't know, do you feel there's any specific challenges or pitfalls that people often sort of fall into when they're trying to communicate their low carbon credentials?
For me personally, I feel like something that people often come across is, like I framed in the presentation, is that honesty and transparency go a long way. So it's not always just about picking out the good things and the successes, because hopefully lots of businesses are making quite big steps in reaching that net zero future. Making sure you're being honest and transparent about the challenges you face as well is really important. I know, for example, I was working on an environmental audit the other week. This one organisation was quite struggling with their waste collection because they didn't have a recycling bin, and they were quite honest and open about the fact they didn't have a recycling bin. And by being more honest about it, they were able to then fast track progress in that, because people were willing to help them out. And as Tony just suggested as well, there's lots of resources out there to try and help you achieve those address those challenges. So just being open and honest and transparent about the challenges you're facing as well as the successes you're having, I think is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Alex. That's really helpful. And you're right as well, of course, the more we share the challenges and difficulties in the task at hand, the more we can sort of see how others are facing those same challenges, and we can learn from each other as well, can't we? So by being transparent, we can often learn from each other and actually find that we're not alone in that position. So yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. Okay, I don't think we've got any more questions in the chat today, so we'll wrap up the session a little bit early, I think. But thank you to everybody for coming along today, and as I say, thank you, Alex and Tony. It's been a great session, and yeah, hopefully we'll see some of you at some future upcoming sessions. If you'd like to find out any more about them or the SELCAN network, please do get in touch with me, or you can complete the registration form for future sessions as you have done for today. Okay. Thank you all, and we'll say goodbye for now.
Thank you very much for having me.
Pleasure. Thank you.